Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, August 6, 2020. Some big news breaking today as the New York Attorney General seeks to abolish the National Rifle Association. And there is new interest in the murder of Seth Rich and his possible connection to the hack of the Democratic National Committee. So the Attorney General of the state of New York, Letitia James, has filed a lawsuit seeking to dissolve, can we say abolish, the National Rifle Association, alleging that years of corruption and misspending have irreparably undermined its ability to operate as a nonprofit. It's almost 150 years old, the gun rights organization, and it is deeply corrupt. There is no question about it. It is chartered as a nonprofit in the state of New York. So, she is alleging that the looting of this nonprofit by insiders, including the top dog, Wayne LaPierre, amounts to $64 million just in the last 3 years. The lawsuit also targets Mr. LaPierre, John Frazier, the organization's general counsel, Josh Powell, a former top lieutenant of LaPierre's, and Woody Phillips, a former chief financial officer. What about Ollie North, huh? He's been very deep in the NRA and the, shall we say, self-enrichment that has been exposed in recent years. So, of course, the NRA is locked and loaded. They fired back with a lawsuit claiming that her action was politically motivated and violated their First Amendment rights. Hey, what about the second, guys? And in addition, the Attorney General of Washington, D.C., Karl Racine, has filed suit against the NRA, which is it's chartered in New York, but it's based in the District of Columbia. And he is seeking changes to the foundation, alleges that the NRA misused millions of dollars of the foundation's funds. And firing back is the NRA president, Carolyn Meadows. This was a baseless, premeditated attack on our organization and the Second Amendment freedoms it fights to defend. You could have set your watch by it. The investigation was going to reach its crescendo as we move into the 2020 election cycle. Well, wait a minute. Aren't we still waiting for Obama to come for our guns? So, what this exposes is that the NRA is locked and bloated. The New York lawsuit alleges that LaPierre spent hundreds of thousands of the organization's dollars on private plane trips, visiting the Bahamas by private air charter at least 8 times in 3 years. He and his family were allegedly gifted the use of a 107-foot yacht by an NRA vendor, spent more than $3.5 million on travel consultants, including luxury car rides over 2 years, and that he secured a golden parachute worth more than $17 million without approval of the board. Well, you know this skirmish will go on for a long time, and I can't wait to see those pleading NRA fund letters to its membership. We're under attack. Help. Send more money. And unfortunately, many of the dupes will. So, we have been told that we are not allowed to discuss the case of Seth Rich, who died on the streets of Washington, D.C., in July of 2016. And while I have never tried to close a case or state unequivocally that Seth Rich was somehow involved in the hacking of DNC servers and the transfer of data to WikiLeaks, I have always considered him one of some suspects. And his unsolved murder case, where he was shot on the street at 4 a.m, no robbery took place, his cell phone, his wallet, his watch, were not taken. And we have been told repeatedly as part of the whole Russiagate scandal, based on the unproven claims of the intelligence community, that it was Russia who hacked the DNC and gave that stuff to WikiLeaks, that we would be hurting the parents, the family, the survivors of Seth Rich if we even asked questions and raised the possibility of his involvement with WikiLeaks. Well, as you may know, Fox News broadcast a report in 2017 where they alleged that Seth Rich had been in contact with WikiLeaks and suggested that he had been the conduit for the purloined emails and other information from the DNC's computer network. So today, the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, that's Lower Manhattan, has filed an unusual document with the senior master of the Royal Courts of Justice in Britain, invoking the Hague Convention of 1970 and asking them, pretty please, because they have no basis to demand it, would you go over to the Belmarsh prison and ask Julian Assange 13 questions, which they conveniently included in their filing. So this has the effect of reopening all of the speculation about Seth Rich, about WikiLeaks, and the family, Joel and Mary Rich, are parties to a lawsuit against Fox News for what they consider to be false reporting. Sham reporting is the adjective that they use. And Fox News has, of course, denied it, and they are defending themselves against this lawsuit. And so the court has determined, and I can't really tell, it's a 60-page brief and I've read half of it, okay? I can't quite tell from the language here whether this was an effort that is supported by Mr. and Mrs. Rich, or if they had no choice because the court has made this request. Certainly Fox News has an interest in getting testimony from Assange on the WikiLeaks side of the story. But they have no way of compelling Julian Assange to answer their questions. The suit does note that Assange initially offered a reward for the identification and arrest of the perpetrator of the murder of Seth Rich, and then increased that money in early 2017. I do not believe there's been any attempt to collect that. So I find this fascinating. And when we look at the list of questions that the court has offered to the British authorities to ask Julian Assange, there are many of the questions that you and I have. What role did Assange have regarding the content of WikiLeaks' release of emails and documents from the Democratic National Committee on July 22, 2016? When were those emails and documents provided to WikiLeaks? How did WikiLeaks obtain them? Which individual or entities provided the DNC emails and documents to WikiLeaks? Which individuals and or entities obtained those materials from the DNC? Describe any role played by Seth Rich, to your knowledge, in obtaining those materials and or providing them to WikiLeaks. And they ask obvious questions. Why did WikiLeaks provide a reward for information related to the murder of Seth Rich? So there are many questions provoked by these questions. Number one, will Julian Assange collaborate? Will it provide him with an opportunity to disclose what actually happened, which could deeply and further undermine the whole Russiagate narrative, the Mueller investigation, the deeply held beliefs of so many Democrats that Russia was the evildoer in this case? Now, if the past is any prediction, Assange has always declined to comment directly on sources. But he's not really in the same position he used to be to withhold any comment. Now, again, the British court, I don't believe, can compel Assange to answer the questions. So it will be entirely up to him if he decides to lift the curtain. We know that Craig Murray, the former ambassador of the British government to a former Soviet republic, has freely stated that he carried a hard drive or a flash drive that he picked up on the campus of American University in Washington, D.C. in July of 2016, and he took it back to London and gave it to WikiLeaks. So I'm very curious about this, and I still don't expect to have these questions answered. But please surprise me. Well, Tuesday was the brutal day in Beirut, Lebanon, when the explosion at its port, which is being blamed on a huge stash of ammonium nitrate, the fertilizer. Well, the Lebanese army took control of the port on the first day of a 2-week state of emergency, and there are growing calls inside and outside the country for an independent investigation. The death count is currently at 157. Thousands of people homeless, thousands, at least 5,000 reported seriously injured, hospitals overwhelmed, COVID is a complication. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, toured the neighborhood near the port, surrounded by hundreds of people calling for revolution and the downfall of the coalition government. And he told them, "I guarantee you this aid will not go to corrupt hands. I will talk to all political forces to ask them for a new pact. I am here today to propose a new political pact to them." Now, by some counts, there are 17 different factions that are part of the coalition government that is presiding over the sharp decline of the nation of Lebanon. And with 17 factions, you can imagine there is a lot of finger pointing. Oh, let me correct myself. There are 18 recognized sectarian groups. I was off by one. So it is a very confusing and depressing situation in Beirut. And yesterday, I shared with you a blog post. It's just one source who claims that he has a source in the Israeli military who said that Israel had a role in igniting this massive explosion. And here is a commentary from a group that is deeply allied with the State of Israel. They're based in the United States, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. And its Senior Vice President for Research, Jonathan Schanzer, published a piece where he blames Hezbollah. Now, let me say that Hezbollah may have a role in this. They may have had a weapons storage cache in the port. But without any evidence, Schanzer suggests that Hezbollah may have been holding on to this big supply of explosive fertilizer to use in some future attack. And I cannot offer any way to support that contention. Schanzer, quote, "While we now know the explosion was a terrible accident, most analysts of the region had to briefly wonder whether the explosion was a military strike. The notion that an outside actor, notably Israel, might have targeted a weapons depot at the port was all too easy to imagine." But of course he moves on to dismiss that. He says Hezbollah continues to stockpile weapons at an alarming rate. Estimates suggest that the group has an estimated 150,000 rockets of varying capabilities scattered across Lebanon, often in high-density population areas. The group has turned the Lebanese population into human shields for its arsenal that is designed to wage war against Israel. In recent months, Israeli officials have warned that Hezbollah is also stockpiling lethal precision-guided munitions that could evade Israeli defenses and hit sensitive targets that could lead to mass casualties. And here's a very damaging statement. He says the Israelis have therefore made it clear that preemption might be necessary. So let's turn to the outspoken Israeli newspaper columnist Gideon Levy, publishing today in Haaretz. And I'm going to try to do this justice, but the mocking tone of Levy's comments cannot be overstated. He opens, "Official Israel presented itself as shocked at the disaster that struck its neighbor Lebanon yesterday. Almost everyone put on a sorrowful face, except for Richard Silverstein, who writes a blog, Tikkun Olam. No one accused Israel of causing the disaster." Silverstein was the source I quoted yesterday. "Except for Moshe Feiglin and a few other racists, no one expressed satanic joy over it. Fortunately, former Israeli army spokesman Avi Benayahu ran Feiglin out of the race. With such statements, you don't belong to the Jewish people," he declared. And, again continuing his mocking tone, Levy writes, "Benayahu is right. The Jewish state never caused such disasters, and when our enemies fell, it never rejoiced. The Israeli Defense Forces, whose voice Benayahu was, never such caused destruction and devastation, certainly not in Lebanon, certainly not in Beirut. What does the IDF have to do with the destruction of infrastructure? An explosion in the Beirut port? Why would the most moral army in the world have anything to do with bombing population centers?" And so the country's leaders hasten to offer help to the stricken land of the cedars, such a typical Jewish and Israeli gesture, human, lofty, and moving to the point of tears. He continues, "True, the Israel Air Force thumbs its nose at Lebanon's sovereignty and flies through its skies as if they were its own. True, Israel has devastated Lebanon twice in war, but who's counting? Israel's president issued a statement of condolences to the Lebanese people. The prime minister and the ministers of foreign affairs and defense said they had given instructions to offer humanitarian and medical assistance to Lebanon." And then Levy notes the mayor of Tel Aviv ordered the municipal building illuminated with the colors of the Lebanese flag. And then, continuing his mocking tone, "Was it not the same defense minister that only last week threatened that the same Lebanon with destruction of infrastructure? Didn't the prime minister also threaten Lebanon? And how does destruction of infrastructure look in Lebanon? Just like what was seen in Lebanon on Tuesday. The sound of thunder shook the city. Black smoke billowed over it, destruction and devastation, civilian blood spilled, 4,000 injured at hospital doors, as described in horror by the ambassador of a European country who had previously served in Israel. Half of Israel and the entire IDF general staff know how to recite the acclaimed Dahiya doctrine. And what is that sophisticated doctrine? It's the use of disproportionate, unbridled force against infrastructure, the sowing of destruction and shedding of as much blood as possible, flattening to teach the enemy a lesson once and for all. The IDF has tried this more than once, in Lebanon and in Gaza, and it was a dizzying success story. It looks just like what was seen in Beirut on Tuesday. Not a week has passed since Israel threatened to destroy infrastructure in Lebanon if Hezbollah dared avenge the killing of one of its fighters in a limited military action on the border. And Israel the destroyer becomes Israel the merciful. Would you accept humanitarian aid from such a country? Is there a more sickening show of hypocrisy? I've linked to this powerful commentary. It's in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. It's provocative. I encourage you to read it. and contemplate. I don't typically engage in what I call anniversary journalism. For me, there is so much going on today that retrospectives often seem like media filler. But I make an exception today because it was 75 years ago, this day, August 6th, that the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. And I feel fortunate that, as a tourist, I visited Japan 30 years ago, and I took the bullet train, the Shinkansen, to Hiroshima. And walking around that city and visiting the Peace Park left an impression that I would compare to the one that I carry from visiting Dachau, the German extermination camp. We exterminated 70,000 people in a flash of nuclear terror. And I want to commend Consortium News, editor Joe Laria, because they've published a series of articles and commentaries about the U.S. use of a nuclear weapon. And I also want to memorialize Claude Etherly. He's an American pilot who flew the weather plane just in front of the Enola Gay. He's the one who gave the green light, if you will, for the mission to be completed. And he lived with that ugly memory and that sense of massive guilt for the rest of his life. I don't know that we called it PTSD at the time, but later in his life he showed severe psychiatric problems. He committed petty crimes. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity by a jury in one of those cases. But he was willing to go public and to express the deep regret, the sorrow that he felt. And while I can't say definitively that no other American involved in the Manhattan Project, involved in the decision to drop that bomb, we were told to speed up the end of the war, and many people believe that Japan was ready to capitulate already, and to bomb heavily populated cities, to conduct a second event 2 nights later in Nagasaki to test out a different nuclear weapon, is one of the deep moral offenses of recent history on this planet. And so I mourn for those who were lost and for those who were a party to those 2 brutal attacks. Interesting story at Mid-Press News today under the byline of Raul Diego. You'll recall that Trump has expressed this fantasy. First, that Iraq owed us oil because, well, we invaded their country and occupied it for years, took out Saddam Hussein, and our payback is, in Trump's mind, to the victor goes the spoils. And, of course, there was no victory in Syria, but we still have a handful of troops, I think it's 150, who are patrolling oil fields in the northeast sector of the nation of Syria. Of course, without the permission of the Assad government. Well, a recently incorporated company from, it's based in Delaware, called Delta Crescent Energy LLC, has been granted a license by the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control to grab that oil, to develop and export crude oil from what remains a partly Kurdish-occupied territory. Now, the Syrian Foreign Ministry doesn't see it that way. They issued a statement. This agreement is null and void and has no legal basis. They condemned the agreement in the strongest terms. So there's a loose band of rebels that was once known as the Syrian Democratic Forces that we funded and armed for years. And the designated hitter in this case includes George W. Bush's former ambassador to Denmark, James P. Kane, James Reese, the CEO of Tiger Swan. He's a former Delta Force commander, and Tiger Swan is a private security contractor, also known as a mercenary group. The third party is John Dorrier Jr., founder of a British-based Houston-located Gulf Sands Petroleum, which has carried out business in Syria in the past. So this is just another bizarre chapter in the Trump saga, where we are not in compliance with our own laws. We are imposing on a sovereign nation, whether you think Assad is a monster or not. And we're planning to just take that oil. And one of the customers that this American group is hoping for is Bashar al-Assad's government. We're going to steal their oil and sell it back to him at a profit. Now, isn't that brilliant? That is free market capitalism at its finest. There's a fascinating look at U.S.-China relations and the imposition of sanctions by the Trump administration on specific leaders of the Chinese government. And it's written by Ai Weiwei, a man I deeply respect, and as you know, I interviewed him. If you just search his name in the search window at peterbcollins.com, you'll find the interview. And, of course, he has a well-informed personal experience. He was harassed and locked up, prevented from working by the Beijing government. And he writes, the U.S. Cold War with the Soviet Union was over ideology, but today's standoff with China is different. The Chinese state has no ideology, no religion, no moral agenda. It continues wearing socialist garb, but only as a face-saving pretense. It has, in fact, become a state capitalist dictatorship. What the world sees today is a contest between the U.S. system of free market capitalism and Chinese state capitalism. The post-Mao dictatorship in China has lived by the principle of repress at home and be open to the world. He notes there are currently 360,000 Chinese students enrolled here in the United States, and over 40 years, at least 1 million, have returned to China and fed their new technical knowledge into the existing authoritarian structures that have built the dictatorship. It might be, he says, the most momentous personnel transfer in history. He tells of his own experience. When he applied to study in the United States in the 1980s, he had to fill out a questionnaire that asked if he'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. He says what happened most often was that Chinese students were quick to see the cultural differences between the two countries and to draw the very logical conclusion that American values are fine for America but would never work in the Chinese system. And if the U.S. hoped for the exportation of values through these individual students would change China, he asks what has actually happened. Returnees are now leaders in much of Chinese business and industry, but anti-American expression in China is as strong today as it has been since the Mao era. So I think it's an interesting piece. There's certainly more to it. I've linked to it in the show file of today's podcast, and I invite you to read it at your leisure. So Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has fired off a blistering letter to the U.S. Department of Justice, offended by the unacceptable use of tear gas in Portland by the federal stormtroopers who were told remain on standby in the city of Portland. And I agree with Ron Wyden. And he asked questions about whether the Justice Department had even done simple research on whether the use of tear gas during a pandemic is a reasonable thing to do. And he goes on and has a litany of questions that he'll probably never get answers to. But what is really, really, really awkward is that it wasn't federal forces on the streets of Portland last night. It was a showdown between a couple of hundred protesters and local police buttressed by a contingent from the Oregon State Troopers. And guess what? Portland police declared a riot for the second night in a row and used tear gas to disperse protesters gathered outside a Southeast Portland police precinct. And as I pick up the account from the Oregonian, their website, by the way, is OregonLive.com, they show how 100 people were there at first and the crowd built up to 200 at most. But because they were targeting a precinct of the Portland Police Department, it seems like the standards for declaring it a riot and the use of tear gas were extremely low. Because according to this account, there were some people who tried to break some glass doors at the precinct. They cracked them. Someone started a fire in a trash can next to the entrance. And that's considered a riot? So they rolled out police in riot gear. After all, they called it a riot, so they had to dress for it, right? It did include state troopers. It wasn't just Portland police. And there were these cat and mouse games where the police line would run at the protesters and try to disperse them, and then the protesters would regroup. But from the news account here in the Oregonian, it seems that there was not an adequate basis for the use of tear gas, which has been forbidden by the city council. And that is a basis for Ron Wyden's complaint to the feds. So the boss of the stormtroopers, Chad Wolf, who is Trump's acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Sieg Heil, he testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and he defended the dispatch of armed federal agents to Portland. And this is so rich because, as you know, no official in Oregon requested federal assistance. This was Trump's idea. He is going to show him that Portland is going to be submitting to his idea of law and order. So Wolf disingenuously said, DHS law enforcement officers received almost no assistance from state and local law enforcement in Portland. They were left to defend the courthouse besieged by attempts of arson and constant destruction. This circumstance should never have happened. Now, as you know, it was the presence of these Trump troopers that triggered more protesters and more aggressive responses. And, of course, in the world of Trump, you can never admit that kind of reality. Wolf told the panel that his personnel suffered 277 injuries between July 4th and the 31st, including several agents who might have permanent damage to their eyes from laser pointers. In addition, he said 142 officers have reported receiving minor burns, lacerations, being hit over the head with a sledgehammer, or hearing issues resulting from the fireworks. Now, that's rich as well, because the feds deployed these flashbang grenades that are more likely to have caused hearing problems for themselves than fireworks coming from the protesters. And I acknowledge protesters did use some fireworks. And it's entirely possible that one of them blew up in the ear of a federal agent. But this very selective use of evidence and information, it activates my bullshit detector, friends. So in our reports from our correspondent Jonah Leto in Seattle, He shared with us the events of June 20th, when Lorenzo Anderson, age 19, was shot, died about an hour later at a Seattle hospital. Police have now identified the alleged gunman as Marcel Levon Long, age 18. He is from Renton, Washington, 20 minutes south of Seattle. They say he left the state shortly after the incident, and he remains at large. Police said anonymous sources ID'd the gunman and provided a phone number for him. And several people have alleged that the two men had a grudge from a fight that occurred about a year ago. Turning to, just by the way, the New York Times did cover this development today, and the local coverage in the Seattle Times indicates that the arrest warrant has been issued, and Long, the suspect, allegedly has an alias. Marcel Green is also known as Celly Cell on social media. They've already set his bail at $2 million. He is an African-American guy with a bit of a fro. And they are saying that Anderson's killing is unrelated to a non-fatal shooting of a 33-year-old man in the same protest area, the CHOP, that occurred about 16 minutes after Anderson was shot. And I checked with Paul Leto in Seattle just to confirm this, but the video and other photos that were used to identify Marcel Long are not related to the police demand for video footage that was not broadcast from local TV stations. Also in Seattle, the city council is taking some actions. They're working through a budget process that is supposed to be completed next Monday. And part of it is they decided unanimously to remove the police from the homeless outreach team, which is called the navigation team. And in a second vote, they agreed 5-4 to eliminate funding altogether for the navigation team and redirect it to nonprofit service providers. Now, there is some controversy here that is not recent. For over 4 years, one of the council members has been critical of the navigation team's tactics and its results. And so this is not some kind of spur-of-the-moment cut. And from my perch well outside of Seattle, I acknowledge that we're going to see an increasing problem of homelessness. And we do need to come up with ways to deal with the tents that are popping up on sidewalks in cities all up and down the West Coast. And I do not support just, wholesale routing of the homeless. But these encampments do create other problems, health issues, access issues, safety issues for local residents. And I acknowledge the complexity of them. And I'd rather have social workers than cops doing the contact with people who are relegated to living in those tents. The bigger proposals to defund, to cut the budget of the Seattle Police Department, have kind of hit the wall. The council's only been able to come up with about $3 million worth of additional cuts. And they are planning to find money elsewhere to start scaling up non-police solutions to homelessness and other issues via nonprofit organizations. One more from Seattle. In an end run on the council's effort to ban the police from using tear gas and so-called less lethal weapons, that resulted in a temporary restraining order that was put into place by U.S. District Judge James Robart. Now, there's more history here as well, because Seattle, like many cities, is under a consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice related to past serious deficiencies. And the guy who is managing that consent decree is U.S. District Judge James Robart. So he's the one who put on hold the city council's action. Now he has extended that restraining order because it was about to expire on Sunday. And he now says, the judge, he would entertain a motion to convert the current temporary restraining order into an injunction if, after its review, the Justice Department believes the council ordinance should not take effect. And given that it's the Trump Justice Department, I think that is a dangerous invitation on the part of the judge. Meanwhile, outside of the view of most Americans and beyond the reach of media, even if they were interested, I want to commend BuzzFeed for departing from its celebrity coverage and the detailed exposés on how mean Ellen DeGeneres is to her staff members. They did a deep dive into incidents at federal immigration jails across the country, starting on June 12th at the Adelanto plant, called it a plant, the Adelanto ICE processing facility in Southern California. Now, that is a private for-profit prison operation. And what we are getting reports on there is that on June 12th, the guards there sprayed and shot pepper balls against more than 150 detainees who were protesting, leading to the hospitalization of at least 4 of them. Detainees were pepper sprayed. One detainee reported a seizure. Another was hit by rubber bullets as he tried to tell the officers that he had leukemia. So these incidents are not isolated. According to BuzzFeed, at least 600 detainees have been subjected to these group uses of force. And there were only 2 use of force incidents in the 6-month period prior to the COVID lockdown. And once again, we have to ask if these tactics enhance the prospects of the transmission of coronavirus in these closed environments. And once again, the lawlessness in the gulags operated by the U.S. government or their for-profit contractors are an obscenity and a real disgrace to America and Americans. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Carl Howard, Perry DiLorenzo, Martin Bilodeau, and Jerry in Southeast Portland. I appreciate each and every one of you for $5 or $10 a month to keep this operation going. And if you'd like to join in, all you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, the conflict continues, the gridlock in Washington, D.C. A lot of finger pointing. And the Republicans are just beyond, any rational thinking. Because whether you like it or not, the HEROES Act was passed by the Democrats in early May. The Republicans waited all summer long. They allowed the $600 a week federal boost to unemployment benefits to expire. They allowed the moratorium on evictions to expire. And as I speak to you right now, there's another meeting underway between Pelosi, Schumer, the White House Chief of Staff, and Steve Mnuchin. Mitch McConnell is kind of out of the picture. And I think he's trying to keep his hands off it because he doesn't want to take the fall. He cannot deliver the votes in the Republican-controlled Senate to pass anything right now. He has signaled in the past couple of days that he's willing to accept the $600 a week as proposed by the Democrats, in effect through the end of December. But now Trump is undercutting again, both sides, really, because based on unknown authorities that only he can claim, he said he's going to use executive orders to extend the $600 a week. He's asking White House officials to look under the sofa cushions for unspent money. And Don, You stole billions to build your wall on the southern border. Why don't you go over there to the Pentagon and steal some more? This time for the good of average Americans. This time to paper over the gridlock that you have helped create in Washington, D.C. And while you're at it, why don't you propose to repeal your 2017 tax cuts that are a $2 trillion drag on the federal debt? So Trump may go through the motions. He's suggesting he may do this as soon as tomorrow. But, of course, the people who own rental properties, they are aghast because the $600 will help some people pay their rent, but not everybody. There are at least 20 million people on the verge of eviction right now. 24 million say that they have little to no chance of being able to pay their rent for this month, for August. And the unpaid rent nationwide has now racked up to $25 billion. And so, as I have argued, renters need help, and so do the small landlords. I'm not concerned about the Kushners and their thousands of apartment units. But the best way to deal with this is to give money to the renters who can pay their landlords, preventing defaults and bankruptcies. There are hard luck stories of people who have a single home that they rent, and it is devastating their personal finances. So we'll see when there is some sort of break in the action in Washington. Meanwhile, Mike Pence, who plays vice president in this soap opera, has started attacking Chief Justice John Roberts for his swing vote that blocked pretextual abortion laws or anti-abortion laws from taking effect. And he's telling people who tune into the Christian Broadcasting Network that the Supreme Court is critical. That's why you got to keep Trump there. Of course, Trump didn't appoint Roberts. He cannot unseat him as Chief Justice. He can only try to pack the court the way he has packed the lower courts. And Joe Biden says that Kamala Harris, the senator from California, is still very much in contention for his VP pick. He defended her in an interview with the National Association of Black Journalists and National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He wouldn't say when he's going to announce. It was supposed to be this week. And he used the talking point that was on his list of notes from an event last week that was captured by a very well-focused camera. And he doesn't hold grudges against Harris for her debate attacks on him last year in July. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, 18.8 million cases identified, 708,000 deaths attributed to the coronavirus. In the United States, the case count is up to 4.8 million. Total deaths up by over 1,200 since yesterday, 158,000. And new projections from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have increased the forecast of the U.S. death total by the end of August up to about 181,000. That is an increase of 6,000 or 7,000 from their projection just a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Deborah Birx, the lady with the scarves at the White House, she said several regions across the country continue to face a troubling number of coronavirus cases. Atlanta, Baltimore, Omaha, Portland, Kansas City, the Central Valley here in California are areas with a very high level of coronavirus cases. She also expressed concern about Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., which she said are doing relatively well, but showing increases in positive test percentages. And she called the outbreaks in Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, and Virginia concerning. and warned against hosting family gatherings in areas with large numbers of cases because they can become super spreader events. We've been focusing on blood clots in connection to COVID-19 over the past couple of days. The Times of New York says that a cyclist in the Big Apple with severe leg pain initially was thought to have a bulging spinal disc. The cause was diagnosed in the nick of time as blood clotting in both legs due to COVID-19. Some patients only have gastrointestinal symptoms and may test negative for COVID-19 if that test is done with a nasal swab, suggesting that the virus sometimes skips the respiratory tract. Despite hundreds of published studies on COVID-19 symptoms, just how common any given symptom is depends on the patient group studied. Older patients are more likely to have cognitive problems, for example. Younger patients are more likely to have mild disease and odd rashes. He got out of the White House today, and it wasn't to play golf. Trump went to Ohio, appeared at a Whirlpool plant, and he is signing an executive order calling on federal agencies to purchase essential drugs and medical supplies made in the U.S. rather than from overseas. Peter Navarro, one of Trump's trade advisors, said we're dangerously overdependent on foreign nations for essential medicines. He argued countries like China and India have an unfair competitive advantage because of their lack of a regulatory environment. And other countries like Ireland have tax incentives in place designed to pull pharmaceutical manufacturing offshore and inside their borders. He didn't indicate how the Trump administration is going to induce American companies to compete with these lower offshore sources. And in Ohio, Trump was scheduled to meet with the governor, Mike DeWine, who has diverged from the president on a number of issues. But Mike couldn't make the meeting because he tested positive for coronavirus in the routine testing of people who are about to meet with Trump. And the State Department has lifted its global Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory that was issued back in March, urging U.S. citizens not to travel overseas. Only problem is, we're not allowed to travel overseas because there are only a handful of countries that will currently allow Americans to enter because we are a rogue nation and we're being quarantined by the rest of the world. I want to thank John Zwiebel, our listener in Hawaii, for sharing with me a report that came from the French outlet France Soir, reporting on an Italian study that has just been completed. They looked at 3,451 patients admitted to 31 clinical centers throughout the nation of Italy. And in an interview with Letitia Jacoviello, who is the director of the Center for Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine at the University of Insubri in Varese. And the report is that the use of hydroxychloroquine is associated with a 30% reduction in mortality. Now, the routine in Italy is that upon hospitalization, patients are given what they describe as a fairly low dose, 400 milligrams once a day for 10 days of hydroxychloroquine. The mortality rate of patients receiving HCQ was 8.9 per 1,000 patients, and the mortality rate of those who didn't get it was 15.7 per 1,000 patients. And the study was not focused on adverse effects, but they say studies already published by these participating centers did not show significant cardiovascular clinical events. So the controversy continues. And I try to remain open-minded here. As I've told you, my bias is that Trump was promoting it, so I viscerally, reflexively reject that. But because of the profit motive in the production of vaccines and drug treatments in this country, when we hear Anthony Fauci declare that HCQ is ineffective, I'm sorry, but it leads to are questioning of why they would reject a drug that appears to be working in at least some of the studies that have been conducted. Now, I recognize the controversy, but my commitment is to continue to bring you the information as it becomes available. So, Facebook and Twitter took action against the Trump campaign. They removed a video based on an interview that Trump gave yesterday to Fox eFriends, where he claimed that children are virtually immune from the coronavirus. And this only embarrasses Facebook and Twitter, because when Trump tells a flat-out lie like Joe Biden wants to defund the police, I wish Joe did, but he doesn't, and it's not an accurate claim. And under the narrow issue of removing materials that spread misinformation about the coronavirus and the pandemic, both platforms removed that video. I'm sorry, their standards are inconsistent, they're arbitrary, and they just encourage a guy like Trump to keep on lying. You've probably heard about some of these big house parties that have become super spreader events across the country. And I don't know who this guy is, but Jake Paul is described as a YouTube star, and he threw a big party at his mansion in Calabasas. Well, the mayor of Los Angeles has decreed that if you throw a party in L.A., they're going to shut off the power and the water within 48 hours. Now, I don't know all the terms of this, how big the party has to be, how big a Q rating the celebrity has to have. But that strikes me as a little extreme. There was a party the other night on Mulholland Drive, the infamous area up there by the Hollywood sign, and neighbors responding to the noise called the cops. The cops showed up and made some of the partygoers move their double-parked cars. But they didn't break up the party. And finally today, I've linked to an article published at The Intercept today, which tracks a pattern across the country of new prosecutors being elected who are not just your law and order, lock them up, throw away the key kind of district attorney. They profile Karen McDonald, who was a prosecutor. Then she ran and got elected as a circuit court judge in Michigan. She won a second term. And then she decided, following the rules, to step down from the bench, wait a year so she could run for prosecutor in Oakland County, part of the Detroit Metro. She says she wants to bring her experience to change the whole scenario in criminal prosecution. And while she's not described as an extreme, like a former public defender like San Francisco's Chesa Boudin, she clearly is a reformer. And she beat a long-time, hardline lock and order district attorney. Also, over in Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County, Eli Savitt won the primary for district attorney. He's a progressive, got more than 50% of the vote. And in St. Louis, I don't think the title is district attorney, but the prosecutor there, whose name is Kim Gardner, defended her first challenge as an incumbent. And she got more than half of the votes cast and will face off against a Republican candidate in November. I consider this real progress, but I'll consider it major progress when we see the first district attorney who was responsible for a wrongful conviction be investigated, charged, tried, convicted, and jailed. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.